Hello ladies and gentlemen, I am Pronago, and today I'm going to be bringing you this set of matches of Krankendau versus ArbuzBudesh. This was played back in the halfway point of June, so it's a little bit on the older side, but I figured we would use this opportunity to take an educational look at Zerg versus Protoss in Cosmonarchy. The most ambitious project ever made for Starcraft 1. Yes, you heard it here first. We got our own launcher and installer, we got our own everything at this point, and so as we get into things here, ArbuzBudesh is going to be the Protoss in the top left, while Krankendau will be our Zerg in the bottom right. Krankendau's been rocking the maroon color. Indeed, that is his color. I like to basically play this guessing game where I take a look at each color at any given time and try to tell you what the name of it is. That's how I open up every single cast. I don't know why, I don't know when it started, but because we have 100 player colors in the game, 100 plus player colors, you can randomly be assigned a really crazy one, or like Krankendau, you can select which one you want in your config file. So that's what we see Krankendau doing here. Arbuz, on the other hand, I'm cheating a little bit because he typed a message. This is periwinkle, and the reason I know is because the chat color is periwinkle at the same time. So as we see here, color periwinkle there. It doesn't stand out because it's the same color as all the other text, but yes, indeed. Look at Mr. Hip Zoomer here. All the Zoomers these days, all the hip Zoomers are playing Cosmonarchy instead of Starcraft 1, so you know this is the real man's game. Now, Arbuz is going for a pylon by his Nexus, and this is significant because he is against Zerg. This is a 4-spawn map, Blackwater Bastion, so it's unlikely you would get 7 pooled, but if you get unlucky enough to do that, maybe they snipe the pylon. That's a lot harder when it's close to the workers, so I believe that would be the thought process. Also, maybe you don't want to miss out on mining time, so if you want to really optimize build, you throw down that pylon from a worker that comes out of the Nexus, and then you immediately go for mining. Another thing to point out is that when you hold Alt, you can see the rally lines. Most players will have this on by default when they select any structure. I have it set to the fact that I need to hold Alt to show it to you guys. But the significance of this is that the workers that create will actually appear on that side of the structure. They'll appear on the left side because that's where the rally point is set to. So something worth pointing out. Eventually, we're going to have the rallies follow the larva so that this Zerg decollision nonsense doesn't happen anymore. That would be nice. So the larva will basically follow the rally angle at some point. That will be a thing that we try to do. Nonetheless, though, we do have the Quasith pool here, as well as a Larvosk. So you saw earlier Krankendau was harvesting Vespene straight from the source. You see Arbuz doing that right now as he gets his Zealot ready, a second gateway on the way. He's already made an Ecclesiast, which is actually a ranged supportive unit, and you can see Krankendau's just going to barge on through. Maybe Arbuz would have been able to deny this scout if he had been able to, stutter step. In fact, I think he was missing only one shot. So he would have denied the scout of the second gate. But nonetheless, Arbuz does put down the third. Something that astute Brood War aficionados will probably notice is that vision is updating a lot faster when you leave an area. We've sped that process up in Cosmonarchy. So in StarCraft 1 by default, when you would leave an area, you leave kind of like a trail of vision because it would update at variable rates, which would effectively make it random as to when a dying scout unit sees something after it dies, or you see an army movement after you already vacate an area. So we wanted to make that a little bit more consistent so people would kind of know, okay, I only really need to wait like half a second. If half a second might be way more time than you really need, I only really need to wait like a quarter of a second before the vision updates and I know my opponent doesn't see anything here. We do have a burrowed Zethracore over here in this location for Krankendau, and when you stand on burrowed units, you reveal them. So Arbuz will see that. Yeah, there you go. He's figured it out, and as a result of doing that, he's able to reveal that Zethracore. That is because, of course, we have incorporated researches into the base units. So you don't have burrow as a tech. You don't have upgrades like Zergling speed, right? These are Zethrakores. They've been renamed. But the Zethracore doesn't need to be upgraded to be as powerful as it is. What you can do is you can mutate every Zerg unit that comes out of the Hatcherosk and the Larvosk Cesiant. Those units that be made, you can turn them into other units. The only exceptions being some tier 3 stuff at the end of the game. And so those evolved mutation strains, those are kind of considered in some ways upgrades. But we won't see that coming anytime soon because Krankendau would need to first evolve his pool into a higher tier pool structure for more tech. Meanwhile, it's just Zealot Ecclesiast out for ArbuzBudesh. It's a very smart composition in the early game when you're still trying to feel out what your opponent is doing, but you see a very large number of Zerg units moving out for Krankendau. He has decided to go pretty all in on the military production, not in the sense where he's not able to transition out. You can see him making workers now, but this composition, depending on if it gets the right kind of engagement here, could absolutely crush what Arbuz has. Now, a lot of this is down to surface area, right? You think about the surrounds, Krankendau trying to set up for a little bit of an oblong engagement here. He's going to go after, I would argue, going after the Ecclesiasts is the big ticket item here, and it looks like indeed he will. As those Zethar cores fall, though, the armor rending, the armor penetration, not going to be there for Krankendau, so these Zealots, which are very beefy as long as their shields are up, are going to be able to even kill the battle worker at the end of the day, but definitely carve through that. So that engagement was mostly made up of Quasilisks. There were maybe 6 or so Zethar cores that ended up getting chewed through eventually through the Zealots. And we see more of them being made. The Vornath is coming, so he is upgrading that pool. That means that he will be able to make some Vorver cores out of his Zethar cores. And that basically means that they'll be rending a little bit of armor, they'll be ensnaring, which is going to apply a debuff that reduces movement and attack speeds. So a very, very powerful supportive unit, as well as being a lot tankier than a Zethar core, but less damage output. So that's what we see him doing here. We knew that it was that because the other option you get from the Vornath pool is an air unit called the Nathra core. It comes straight from the larva, but it requires a lot of Vespene. So the fact that Krankendau isn't mining the gas here, isn't mining the ridge here, which gives you about half as much gas as the geyser, and is only mining his main geyser with 2 workers, it kind of tells you, okay, he's not doing a gas-intensive style right now. He's just going to be trying to catch up in workers. Now, Arbuz has had his Nexus put down, and it has finished. He's going to start saturating that a little bit. I will point out that even though the Zerg was behind in workers for a while, it did have more workers or more bases for a longer period of time, but that only really impacts the harvesting of Vespene. Your fall off on that is a little bit quieter there, so we'll get more into the economic details after this battle, but you can see here, that was a really nice sort of stuffing from Arbuz, and now he's taking advantage of Brood War's very efficient pathing as he drives this Zerg force back. But what you saw Arbuz do is actually put his Zealots to the left so that they couldn't be surrounded, and now he's kind of catching it at a good time. A couple workers being pulled, that's going to screw up the AI because, of course, the targeting is going to immediately default to trying to kill the military units, and you can see Arbuz maybe biting a little bit more than he can chew. These Zealots are staying alive for a very long time, though, has to be said, but really time is on the Zerg side. He's going to be the one building circuits. At this point, you're going to have to start falling away from those defensive structures, and you don't really have that many more Ecclesiasts left to burn. So your ranged harassment capabilities are pretty low here. In fact, honestly, if I'm Krankendau, I'm thinking about just sicking myself onto this bottom Ecclesiast. He can't exactly withdraw too well. And the Zealots are actually going to offer themselves up as Arbuz pans back over to his natural, see what's going on there. A couple Zealots get hemorrhaged, and maybe Krankendau can start to get rid of these. But no, a Vanguard, a defensive man. You can see he's very similar to getting stuck in the mineral line in general. You know, you think about PvZ at a high level of Starcraft 1. This is a trick you would see as the Zealots being kind of put in a certain location. But you can see here, you know, the time is limited when the Quasilisk is out. That's what this ranged unit is. It doesn't do very well versus armored targets, but it's obviously very good at dealing with the Ecclesiasts. And yeah, there you go. It's going to be able to clean that up. 10 workers being made. One Zealot is going to sneak in and get a nice scout. Obviously, you knew the Vornath was here, but you see double Larvosk, and you see the worker count. You see, okay, you know, pretty standard stuff here. I think he's on hold position in here like at StarCraft 2. That's not exactly going to work. He might get a worker kill. He does. And you know what? If he's not careful, Krankendau could lose another one, but there we go. Finally puts that beast down. And it's been a transfer into Drakidons. These are the Dragoon replacement. You can see them being made out of the gateway here. We do have a Warden and a Matrix for defense. Obviously, that can easily get overwhelmed by Zethar cores, but if it does stay up, you know, it can be very, very difficult to uproot. And now Krankendau has made a pivot into gas harvesting. You can see him going straight for that ridge. He's adding a Hydrith Den, another Kagrant for another Larvosk, presumably. So just expanding his production. The Larvosk costs a lot of Vespene, whereas the Hatrosk is still just 300 minerals, just like the Hatchery was. Adding the Zorka Shroud as well. We'll think about that, because I feel like maybe Krankendau is trying to get everything. He's getting that ArbuzBudesh, just trying to unlock every single thing he can possibly get. A couple Quasis being dispatched to scout, reveal the Drakidons. This should be a pivot into Hydras if he had the Den already, but definitely Zeths in the meantime, a couple of them being made. Circuits being added for a little bit more time buying. Makes a lot of sense, you know, anti-surface defense. Definitely something that is going to be afforded the Zerg here. Mark that one off your bingo card. As the third base is getting on faster for Arbuz than it is for Crank, but that doesn't mean that he's out of the game just yet. He's got Vorvs coming, making more and more and more circuits, even canceling one of them. Not a bad shout, because you can kind of tell that, like, the aggression isn't... there's no kill pressure with that army, right? So the reason I was sort of to myself about the Zorkas versus the Hydrith is that there's a critical gas amount that you want to reach as Zerg, which is about 900 gas, because that is going to afford you the Iral Iris. And the reason why this is an important number is because the Iral Iris is your tier 2 tech up structure. Now, Protoss don't really have that. Instead, you see Stargates being added. There's no tech requirement for that. You just go straight into Stargate, and you're able to get it. You can actually just be, your first production structure could literally be like a tier 4 endgame production structure. The problem is you would never get enough money for it in the early game, so you just end up getting crushed. It would be very, very greedy to try to do that, even in like a team game where somebody could try to play cover for you. But especially in a 1v1, you would just die. So it's not logically feasible, but it is technically possible, and so that's the best kind of possible. Now, I say that, but Arbuz going for Stargate tells me he's probably going to be pairing Gladiuses with that. We'll get back to that in a moment when they see what's going on. We can talk a little bit more about some of these units. The Hydralisk, you know it, you love it. Pretty standard stuff. The Lakizalisk, it's been changed from the Lurker in that when it burrows and attacks, it actually has a projectile that returns back to it. So you can hit the same units twice, which is obviously very good for cleaving through gateway armies. And that would be the logical choice versus the Zealot heavy comp. But when you see the Drakadon switch, actually Zorka's units don't make as much sense. The Zoryus, when it takes damage, it spawns a Broodling, basically, a Rotherokor. And the reason why you would want it in your fight is because when it makes contact with an enemy unit and attacks them, they become like a beacon, sort of, that accelerates the movement rate of all incoming allies. So any sort of Zethakors or any of these Gorgakors, like these flying melee units, those kinds of units, anything like that, they will move faster towards the victim of the Zoryus's attack. So that is definitely a good thing to keep in mind. We actually have an artisan being made. I'll talk about that a little bit later. That's an advanced worker for the Protoss. Comes out of the embassy, which I can't remember where I saw it. Oh, yes, right here. So those advanced workers harvest directly. They don't need to return to anything. So these artisans are going to be dispatched over here. They'll be tasked onto those geysers. But we see a big engagement taking shape over here as Krankendau is trying to take his third base elsewhere on the map. You can see the ensnare from the Vorvikor activating there onto that Warden, but there's already an engram for splash damage. Now, that's the only crowd control that ArbuzBudesh has. So even though this looks pretty bad for Krankendau to try to kind of cleave his way in, the Gladiuses with their chain bounces can definitely help, but there's only 2 of them right now. The Hydras can still do some pretty good damage. Lakizalisk's just inching forward here. I think there's a single witness at the third. Indeed there is, but there's no witness for detection right now. There it is. Has popped out there. So Arbuz not without the ability to fight back over here. So you know what, Krankendau, he stabs in, he destroys the wall before it can really come into play, and there's the Iral Iris I was talking about with that gas benchmark. Warden's coming down for more static defense. I did like what Arbuz was doing. I think he was putting down like a gateway or something, and that was definitely going to frustrate the general movement of a lot of what Krankendau had. But look at his natural. His natural is so exposed right now. Krankendau doesn't know it, but he could just charge in to the natural with his army. Now, here's the artisans in action. You can see them harvesting from the geysers. This is one of the main uses they have. They are tier 2 worker. They are gas intensive, so definitely something you got to watch out for. But eventually, if you get enough of them, sure, yeah, you can start saturating the minerals as well. Definitely a play. Now here's Krankendau trying to cut off any attempt at reinforcing. The witness is here, so those Lakizalisks will be destroyed, and the Gladius count is actually screaming up, climbing up even higher. The longer that these bounces stick around, the more damage the Zerg is going to take. You can see a lot of those units ended up getting bruised. Not a lot of mileage out of that attack force Krankendau had. There's a couple of dead Zealots, a couple of dead Drakadons, but that was pretty much it. Now these Gladiuses are starting to leak out a little bit here, and the 12 o'clock is being taken directly by Arbuz, but harvesting that Vespene is going to allow him to get up to a higher amount of Gladiuses, a higher amount of, endgame tech in general. 4th base and 5th base starting at the 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock positions for Krankendau. So we're getting into a nice macro game here, and I'm liking what I'm seeing. Definitely some good action here. As the tier 2 is complete, we're going to see the second upgrade of the pool, the final one, its final form. Sort of like this Quasilisk trying to do a Super Saiyan maneuver. Such is the way of decollision in Brood War sometimes. There you go. He figured it out. We panned back and he was gone. So the Calcure Lake gives you access to one of Krankendau's favorite units. Oh, he's using a Noveleth for detection. Worth noting, Spraiths and the like do not have detection anymore. You need to build dedicated detection. Before you ask, what about, Kabbalah, Dark Templar, they're called Kabbalists here, but what about all of the cloaked units? Well, the Protoss cloaked units reveal when they attack, and the Terran cloaked units reveal when you get close to them. So there's a way to, and of course Zerg, you can reveal by stepping on them. So you still want the witness for stuff like the Lakizalisk. You saw it in that fight. When you burrow those units, you're not really going to have a great time dealing with them by standing on them. Unless you have like really stocky units, like, admittedly Protoss does. So you still want that detection, but the witness is, of course, the observer. I'm trying to remember to use the old name so people can acclimatize, but yeah, you're going to be able to see the that sort of stuff take shape, and the observer, witness, right, is being defeated by the Ovaleth here is the idea behind Krankendau's composition. He's going to use that. I don't know if he's planning to use it for transport. He's actually bringing it back home now. But he's definitely going to be thinking about using it to snipe the witnesses so his Lachelisks can get up. And look at this wall of wardens and engrams and a single matrix. Good grief. That is a lot of static defense that Arbuz is setting up at the 12 o'clock position. And, it kind of makes sense. You're seeing a lot of workers waypoint to a couple of different locations. No gas saturation at these satellite bases yet. Krankendau trying to fix that at 6. And his army is kind of out on the map a little bit, but still in his territory. Some static defense going down for him. He's had a bunch of units sort of patrolling around, trying to catch where the Protoss is going. But crucially, this Zethra hasn't gone deep enough to see the geyser harvesting artisans, right? Well, I guess it has in here, but Krankendau hasn't noticed it when the Zeth does get close enough. So that's the only one that he would have any hope of actually knowing. Versus a player like Arbuz, you got to watch out. And in general, I feel like Protosses are going to start trying to make use of artisans because, you know what, even if they get like zoned away and you pull them back, you can still use them to like harvest. Worst case scenario, they still end up being workers, right? So you can still harvest from other things. But yeah, this is getting pretty crazy. So you can see Arbuz panning his way over to the 9 o'clock position. Looks like that'll be his next base. We do have a bunch of Vithrilisks being added. That's going to help deal with the Gladiuses. If you go Vithrilisk, yeah, okay. So the Lyrilisks are the very fast-moving units. You actually evolve them from Quasis, and that was Krankendau's favorite unit, pretty much. That's been one of his favorite units, alongside the Lachelisks, which we don't see any more of being made, going for a mobile army instead. I actually think if he had gone for Bactylisks alongside that's a Hydralisk evolution, if he had gone for that, I feel like that would have been a really nice play alongside the Vithrilisks, because the Vithrilisks, the Devourer graphic, it obviously rends armor, but one crucial change that the Vith has is that when you hit an air unit that already has the debuff from the Vithrilisk, it spreads to nearby units, including ground units. So if the Gladiuses are fighting on top of the Dracodons and stuff, they are also going to be armor debuffed. Now, meanwhile, there is a Demiurge out. The Demiurge is one of the most powerful units the Protoss has. It is an endgame unit. And one of the things that the Demiurge is capable of doing is taking control of fallen combatants. But it needs to be close enough to do that. The Vagrants over there, they have a sort of become a more powerful unit after death passive, and they died, and it didn't really matter that they were more powerful because they're just all dead. But we do have land effects out. So the land effects are, of course, it's like the Corsair, right? But it's been remodeled, so, nobody should complain about the fact that it's a new unit name. It attaches Disruption Field to itself, but I don't think that's going to factor in here. I think they're here for splash. Now, that being said, the Lyrilisks bounces have just utterly eviscerated it, and now there is not really any dedicated splash, right? It's just the Gladiuses. But where is the chaff to deal with the ground army? I think Krankendau has mostly lost everything there. The Gorgakors have all died, but look at the Vithrilisks just tearing through the armor, allowing those Lyrilisks bounces to get so much mileage. Now the only problem is you've got a bunch of Viths and they're not really doing anything, so that's a little bit of a concern. The Lyrilisks trying their best to just hemorrhage this Gateway army, and it is working out pretty well, but Krankendau's got a big bank and he's not really spending it on anything. He's got that one Zeth heckling the base on the top right that's being set up. That's the top right spawn natural. The Demiurge not being focused down here. I'm not sure how to feel about that one, but you know what? He can deal with the rest of the Gateway army at the very least. You can see some of those units have been taken over, but it's kind of inconsequential with these numbers. The way that the Demiurge works is that as long as it's nearby a fallen enemy combatant, it will take them, and it takes 5 seconds to complete the transformation, so to speak. But after that point, they take more damage than they would otherwise, but they move faster in the presence of enemies. So that's the sort of trade-off you get for when you steal enemy units with the Demiurge. They become kind of in a frenzy of worship. So all the while, we're trying to figure out what Krankendau is doing. Let's take a look at the base here for Arbuz. I don't know what's up with all these pylons. I noticed he has a power brick over here as opposed to a normal pylon outlook. He's got the rogue galleries building Vagrants. He's got Stargates continuing to pump the Gladiuses, those fearsome ships. He's also made a couple of land effects here. Now, this is an engagement that definitely favors Arbuz, but if Krankendau can commit all of these forces in, pick this Demiurge, for example, and then maybe just deny this base before anything too crazy happens, that can definitely help out. There's the Demiurge, a lot of Vests being taken out. Land effects are dead. We got some more over here. They're not so good versus the Vithrilisks, it has to be said. The high health pool definitely stops them from being as efficient as they could be. And here's a much better engagement for Krankendau now that they're kind of funneling up over here. This Gateway Army and the Vagrants out of the Rogue Gallery, they are just going to be completely annihilated and nullified here. There's a chance that Krankendau can even reinforce this position, but he's not actually making any combat units right now. He does have a pretty big force of, frontline units. These are all meat sort of frontline units. Not very good at, anything in particular there, besides, as far as doing damage is concerned, but definitely good at absorbing a lot of damage. And you can see the reinforcements from Arbuz are going to clean this up nicely. So he doesn't end up killing the Nexus. He doesn't kill any of the Demiurges. He's going to charge forward with all of these frontline units, but you got to remember that the way that the Demiurge control stuff is within, a melee range. And so not exactly the best move unless you're buying time for some DPS. And I think Krankendau's realizing, oh yeah, all my DPS is gone. He's going to go ahead and add the Mutat Spire. He is getting tier 3, which is very exciting. We hardly ever see that. So this is a treat for sure. And another base being set up, sort of the counter-natural. We're actually seeing, this base got canceled earlier. Well, actually, it didn't get canceled. It just got outright destroyed before it could finish. This base just got wiped of workers for the most part. And as a result, Arbuz is kind of down, right? He's got 4 functioning bases. He's trying to reset up his 5th. But his attempted 6th at 9 o'clock did get denied. Spire at 6 o'clock. Interesting choice for that. But you know what? Makes sense. Why not? We do have the bottom left natural being taken by Krankendau, as that will be his 6th base. So he is up on bases as a result of that. Both players capping their geysers. You'll notice you can harvest directly from the geyser, but you can upgrade by putting a gas cap on, as we call it colloquially. Now, the only thing here is that obviously I was trying to show that both players were doing it, and Arbuz forgot his natural. But that's okay. Not really that big of a deal. Oh, okay. I see you maybe like wardens. Yeah, you might be a warden man. So that's Arbuz. That's Arbuz's idea for this. He's just going to build a lot of wardens. I feel like you can still overwhelm that pretty easily, especially if you had like Vilgoricors. There's a Zerg unit that requires the Matraval Nest, which we don't see. Oh, he's going Gezkath. Okay, so this could be a couple of things, but I would love to see it be Cascathalors, but I think in practice, that's like a ground siege strain. In practice, it's probably going to be Alcagalisks, one of the most ultimate Zerg units that you can get. That plus the Chokol Chazal, if he was feeling frisky, he could definitely do that. But he could also upgrade the Spire now that he's at tier 3 and go for Sovraleth. Sovraleths are kind of like the Zerg super weapon. So all you need to know is we might see giant space whale units because of this structure, or this structure could mutate and we might see a literal just like swarming behemoth of individual units screaming across the map. That's kind of how I can describe those two. And maybe if I get my way, we'll see Cascathalors, which are the ground siege strain. They kind of look like elephants with biocannons. I don't know exactly how else to describe them. We're going to upgrade a lot of the graphics later on, don't worry. But here we go. Bit of a couple of reclaimed Zerg units in the mix. Why not? Vithrilisk's debuffing a lot of these gateway units underneath all of those Gladiuses. The bounce attacks from the Lyrilisk still doing a lot to help defeat those Gladiuses before they can really get a crazy amount of bounce damage dealt themselves. It's kind of like bounce v bounce. We have some Protaflors over here. You can kind of think of them as Zerg sniper units, but they haven't really been able to deal with anything other than sort of like the mid-range units. They haven't been able to focus down the actual Demiurges, and now we see Hierophants being added into the mix. That's going to be an interesting choice, because if they stack up their passive enough times, they're actually going to increase the attack rate of all Protoss frontline units over here. However, I'm not sure that they're actually being capable of doing that just yet. It looks like this is going to thin the herd enough. Krankendau will need to reinforce. He's got 5,000 minerals in the bank. He needs to fall away and think about what else he's going to make. He's just making more tier 2 units right now. He has the Gezkath Grotto. What is he going to do with it? He queues up 20 Lyrilisks, 27 Quasis, 1 Teth Zorikor, a classic maneuver, setting up the base down here in the bottom left natural. But I feel like there's a window of opportunity where Arbuz could start rolling through some of these bases. This is very well fortified. You even see some of the tier 2 anti-surface defenses, some of the tier 2 anti-air defenses as well. But for the most part over here, we are looking at a very, very weak Zerg army because he's not really taking advantage of his tech. He's making 18 Protaflors. The Protaflors actually mutate into the Sovraleth, so that Zerg sniper unit can turn into the unit that blots out the sun with its power. However, this Spire still has not been enchanted. It's not been mutated, right? So as a result, you are still stuck without that ability. He made the Grotto, but he hasn't really used it for anything, so I'm wondering what's up with that. You can see Krankendau just, he's not actually being able to kill this Scribe, unfortunately. Oh, maybe. No, definitely not. See you, nerd. Well, that should alert to Krankendau that indeed the 9 o'clock base is being retaken. Top right main has been taken. That was kind of like a foregone conclusion. But at the same time, Yeah, we kind of have like, if Krankendau can hold the bottom left area and this base comes up at 9 o'clock for Arbuz, we are looking at a dead even game in terms of the base count, 24 minutes in. Well, here's a big force of nothing but Lyrilisks. We are seeing the Gazithalors. You can turn those into the Alcagelis, the giant space whale units, so we might see those come into fruition a little bit later, but they're not in the fight right now. They're still being made back at home, and there's only 2 of them being made, in fact. So this giant sort of line of Lyrilisks this is kind of playing into the Protoss' hands, I fear. There's not really any front line left. And if there were, maybe the Demiurges would take them over. But everything that is not a Demiurge is dying right now. And the Protathalors are left over to try to snipe down the units. But there are no reinforcements, really. We got all these frontline units that would love to come in with the fight. But Krankendau, he hasn't really been able to spend them down. Now going to go ahead and try to make Tetzoricors. I feel like there's only so many times you can win an army fight so dominantly. And I say so dominantly. Arbuz did lose a lot of, mid-range units and short-range units in that fight. But there's only so many times you can lose those kinds of things with that before you feel empowered, and especially with the Gazithalors getting immediately sniped by this Protoss force, these units morphing on the front lines. Krankendau might not have spent his bank down very swiftly, very intelligently in this end stage game. He's even given over one of the Gezis to his opponent. And those are the kinds of units you really don't want to take about. Like, think about this. If you're taking mind control, if you're mind controlling the front line and they take more damage, well, then they're not going to be as good of a frontline unit, but it's still going to be something better than having nothing, right? So it's still a win to take them. But if you're taking siege units that normally move slowly, well, they're going to move faster, and they're going to, yes, they're going to take more damage, but they're siege units, so they're probably not going to get collapsed upon in the same way. So that's the kind of thing that you really want to watch out for, is allowing the Demiurges to snipe your backline units and steal them and make them worship the Demiurge instead of the whatever god Zerg worships. And don't say the Overmind, because we removed him from the lore. He's out. Fanfictioned out. See ya. Now, this base is going to start to get heckled upon. Not very many static defenses over here, unfortunately, for Krankendau. He hasn't really been able to, despite having a lot of time here to think about it, he hasn't really made any Cascathalors for the crowd control. He hasn't really made any more Gezis. He's got 3 more hatching, but I feel like this is a really rough situation for Krankendau to be in. He is starting to hemorrhage the units left and right. There's this big blob of Protoss units that, you talk about death balls and stuff, like if you think about Starcraft 2. You can see the style doesn't really work here for Starcraft 1 and similar style games in the case of Cosmonarchy. Because, yeah, you might have this giant blob, but it's not going to move around very elegantly, right? There's no fluid pathing or anything like that. More and more frontlines streaming in. Gazithalor standing tall, dealing 650 damage. I can't believe it. And GG has to be called. Because Krankendau, he had the tempo with the tech. He had a lot of potential there with that fight. I feel like he could have done some stuff there, but sadly, he's not able to clinch it in the end. Now, Krankendau will be playing in tomorrow. I'm posting this game today, but tomorrow's game, tomorrow's tournament. So check us out there, because we do have tournaments every so often, and you can see some competitive Cosmonarchy of varieties of different ways. So definitely check us out there. There's so many different skill levels on display, and the fact that Arbuz is able to take that, I mean, I'm surprised. I definitely thought Krankendau had it in the bag when he started dropping the Gezcath and maybe the Spire, but figuring out the decisions in the mid game and the late game, that can be difficult. The game's got 50 units per race. There's a lot to pick from, and sometimes you got to really think about, what do I actually need in this situation? And especially compounding that you maybe don't get to practice late game very often either. But hey, we've got unit tester maps and stuff like that, so you can definitely think about that stuff. But anyway, that's it for me. GG's. We'll be back tomorrow for another game, and of course for the tournament. So strap in and stay tuned.